It began not with kings or empires, but with rivers, roots, and rain. In a land where forests breathe mist and soil hold stories, early communities shaped a world guided by memory, rhythm, and intuition. They watched the stars, whispered to the wind, and carved meaning into clay long before stone met monument. Over time, they turned wild seeds into harvests, trade paths into networks, and rituals into powerful bonds. What emerged was more than survival. It was vision, a vision that lifted platforms from floodplains, echoed thunder in colossal stone, and bound the sacred to the everyday. This is the Olmec civilization, a culture born from earth and imagination, rooted in landscape but reaching for the cosmos. It is the origin point of Mesoamerican wonder, a beginning carved into jade, whispered in jungle winds, and still felt beneath our feet. As the sun rises, the sea glows like liquid fire, stretching toward a horizon where the Gulf of Mexico kisses skies awash in gold and flame. Here, in the steaming lowlands of what future peoples will call Veracruz and Tabasco, morning mist rises from rivers that snake through jungles so dense that jaguars disappear like shadows between buttressed cecropia trees. This is a realm where the earth itself sweats fertility, where rainfall comes in torrents that turn streams into rushing highways, and where the soil grows black and rich as chocolate beneath canopies that filter sunlight into cathedral beams. Across these verdant floodplains, where the Coatzacoalcos River winds like a sacred serpent toward the sea, families who have learned to read the rhythms of flood and drought carve their destinies from landscapes that promise abundance to those wise enough to understand their moods. Children wade through waters warm as blood, their small hands plucking fish that flash silver in the dappled light, while their mothers gather roots whose names carry the wisdom of generations. The very air thrums with life, howler monkeys roaring their territorial claims, parrots shrieking in riots of emerald and scarlet, insects buzzing in clouds so thick they sound like distant drums, in clearings hewn from jungle walls that tower overhead like green cathedrals. Itzel kneels beside her grinding stone as the first light penetrates the canopy above. Her hands, stained dark from countless mornings like this one, work kernels of teosinte, the wild grass whose modest seeds hold within them the promise of transformation. Each grain requires patient crushing, the rhythmic sound of stone against stone, creating a percussion that harmonizes with the awakening forest. Sweat beads on her brow despite the morning coolness, for she knows that the sun climbing through the leaves will soon turn this paradise into a furnace where only the strongest endure. Beside her, Akbal tends fires that have burned without interruption since his grandfather's time, their smoke rising in pillars that speak to the gods of their people's devotion and need. His weathered fingers select wood with the care of a priest choosing offerings. Mahogany for steady heat, cecropia for quick flames, copal for the sacred smoke that carries prayers skyward. The flames dance like living spirits, their light catching the jade ornaments that hang from his ears, precious stones won through seasons of patient trading, with peoples who dwell in distant mountains where such treasures grow like gifts from the earth's heart. Waters that define this landscape flow with the patience of eternity itself, carrying silt that enriches fields while connecting scattered villages through channels that serve as highways for dugout canoes. Paddlers who navigate these liquid roads develop arms like tree trunks and eyes that can read currents invisible to lesser mortals. They carry more than goods between settlements. They bear news of distant rains, stories of successful harvests, warnings of floods that might threaten downstream neighbors, and always the seeds of innovation that flow between minds as surely as water flows toward the sea. Among the cargo that fills their narrow vessels, cacao pods rest like brown treasures, whose value surpasses mere nutrition. Nahuala breaks these sacred fruits with reverence, her strong fingers extracting beans that will become the drink of nobles and the currency of traders. The bitter liquid that emerges from these beans carries within it the essence of the gods themselves, each sip a communion with forces that control rain and harvest, love and war. Children who taste this divine elixir for the first time wrinkle their faces in disgust, not yet understanding that some truths require adult wisdom to appreciate. Rubber trees that grow wild throughout these jungles bleed white latex when properly cut, their sap hardening into material that bounces like captured moonbeams and burns with flames that never die. It's Samna, master of secrets that his father taught him beneath stars that witnessed the first dawning, knows exactly when to score the bark and how deep to cut without killing the tree that provides such miraculous substance. His hands work with surgical precision, each incision planned to maximize yield while ensuring the tree's survival through seasons yet to come. In plots carved from jungle floor, where sunlight penetrates the canopy in scattered beams, experimental farmers tend plants whose ancestors knew only wildness. Beans that once grew as vines strangling forest giants now climb neat poles, arranged in patterns that maximize both yield and convenience. Squash that spread wild tentacles across jungle clearings now grow in orderly rows where their massive fruits can be easily harvested. Each generation of cultivators learns to select seeds from the finest specimens, gradually transforming wild plants into docile servants that produce food beyond their ancestors' wildest dreams. Tlakalel, whose grandmother first noticed which plants produced the largest seeds, now tends varieties of teosinte that bear kernels 3 times the size of their wild ancestors. His fields represent generations of accumulated wisdom, each planting season building upon lessons learned from countless experiments in coaxing abundance from reluctant earth. When he plants, his calloused hands move with the confidence of one who understands the secret partnership between human intention and natural forces. Manioc roots that burrow deep into rich soil provide insurance against seasons when above-ground crops fail to thrive. These tuberous treasures store months of nutrition in underground chambers that floods cannot reach and droughts cannot wither. Women who master the complex processing required to transform bitter roots into nourishing flower gain status that rivals that of successful hunters. Their knowledge of which varieties produce the sweetest roots becomes crucial inheritance passed from mother to daughter, like precious heirlooms. Around fires that burn throughout the night to discourage prowling jaguars, families share more than warmth. They exchange the accumulated wisdom that transforms individual discovery into collective knowledge. Stories that begin as simple accounts of successful planting techniques evolve into complex narratives that encode agricultural wisdom in forms that children can remember and repeat. The old woman who first learned to read the subtle signs that predict early floods becomes a legend whose tale teaches practical lessons wrapped in entertainment that makes learning feel like pleasure. Ceramic arts that emerge during these formative centuries reflect both practical necessity and aesthetic ambition that elevates daily life beyond mere survival. Clay that lines riverbanks transforms under skilled hands into vessels whose forms serve specific purposes, while displaying beauty that feeds souls as surely as food nourishes bodies. Cooking pots whose round bottoms distribute heat evenly, storage jars whose narrow necks prevent contamination, ceremonial bowls whose painted designs tell stories of gods and heroes. Each piece represents hours of patient labor, guided by traditions that grow richer with each generation. Decorative patterns that adorn these ceramic masterpieces encode meanings that extend far beyond mere ornamentation. Wavy lines that represent flowing water, step designs that symbolize mountains reaching toward heaven, animal forms that capture the essence of jaguars and serpents. Each motif carries significance that transforms utilitarian objects into vehicles for spiritual communication. Artists who master these symbolic languages gain influence that extends throughout their settlements, their vessels becoming treasured possessions that families preserve across generations. Trade networks that connect these river villages to distant regions begin as simple exchanges between neighboring peoples, but gradually expand to encompass territories that span vast distances. Obsidian that arrives from volcanic highlands cuts flesh more cleanly than any metal known to ancient peoples, its edges sharper than surgeons' scalpels and its translucent beauty rivaling precious stones. The merchants who carry these volcanic treasures through dangerous territories develop skills and connections that make them indispensable intermediaries between isolated populations. Jade that flows from Guatemala's highlands commands reverence that transcends its mere material value. This sacred stone, harder than steel, yet workable by patient artisans, embodies the essence of growing things, its green hues capturing the spirit of maize shoots, forest canopies, and precious quetzal feathers. When properly carved and polished, jade ornaments seem to glow with inner light, their surfaces reflecting celestial forces that lesser materials cannot contain. Chiefs who wear jade regalia proclaim their connection to powers that control rainfall, fertility, and the movements of heavenly bodies. Salt that crystallizes in coastal lagoons where seawater evaporates under brutal suns provides preservation that transforms seasonal abundance into year-round security. The families who control these natural salt works develop techniques for harvesting and purifying their precious product that enable them to supply inland populations whose diets would otherwise lack this essential element. Caravans that carry salt along river routes return laden with goods that coastal peoples cannot produce themselves. Highland obsidian, forest products, and agricultural surplus from fertile inland valleys. Near the spring at El Manatee, where crystal-clear water wells up from depths that seem to reach the underworld itself, wooden sculptures appear like gifts from gods who dwell beneath the earth's surface. Carved with tools that leave no marks their creators can identify, these mysterious figures display artistic sophistication that suggests divine rather than human craftsmanship. Their discovery transforms this natural wonder into a shrine that attracts visitors from throughout the region, their offerings creating the first great treasure deposit known to these peoples. Ritual deposits that accumulate at this sacred site reveal the growing complexity of spiritual practices that distinguish civilization from mere survival. Jade axes, whose edges have never known use, suggest ceremonial purposes that transcend practical applications. Wooden busts that capture human features with startling realism imply portrait traditions that preserve the memory of important individuals. Mirror fragments made from polished magnetite reflect more than physical appearances. They serve as windows into spiritual realms where ancestors dwell and gods observe the actions of mortals. Wealth begins to accumulate in the hands of families whose innovations produce consistent surpluses or whose skills serve collective needs. The carver, whose artistic gifts create ceremonial objects. The healer, whose knowledge of medicinal plants saves lives. The trader, whose networks bring essential goods from distant regions. Each contributes value that elevates their status within increasingly complex societies. Granaries that overflow with surplus grain enables some families to release members from food production to pursue specializations that enrich community life. Chiefs who prove their worth through successful management of agricultural cycles or successful negotiation of trade agreements find their influence expanding beyond their immediate kinship groups. The councils that form around such leaders become training grounds where future generations learn the arts of governance, diplomacy, and community management. These early rulers derive their authority not from inherited privilege, but from demonstrated competence in activities that benefit entire settlements. Elevated platforms that raise buildings above seasonal inundations require engineering knowledge that encompasses soil mechanics, hydrology, and structural engineering. The earthworks that create these artificial highlands represent collective labor projects that unite entire villages in efforts whose benefits will serve generations yet unborn. What begins as simple flood protection gradually evolves toward monumental expression that serves spiritual as well as functional purposes. Construction techniques that emerge from practical necessity grow increasingly sophisticated as platforms oriented toward cardinal directions align with celestial movements and decorated with carved elements that represent supernatural forces. These early monuments foreshadow the magnificent achievements that will define later civilizations, their forms suggesting cosmic symbolism that connects earthly structures to heavenly powers. Water management systems that control the destructive power of floods while harnessing their fertilizing benefits require engineering sophistication that rivals achievements of more famous ancient civilizations. Canals that channel overflow away from settlements while directing it toward agricultural fields prevent damage while maximizing benefit. Reservoirs that store water during abundant seasons provide security during droughts while enabling expansion of cultivation into areas that natural rainfall alone cannot support. Astronomical knowledge that accumulates through patient observation of celestial cycles provides frameworks for organizing both agricultural and ceremonial activities. Families whose members track the movements of sun, moon, and planets develop calendrical systems that enable precise prediction of seasonal changes. The ability to forecast optimal planting times, anticipate flooding cycles, and schedule religious ceremonies creates authority that extends throughout surrounding regions. Religious practices emerge from the intersection of agricultural necessity and cosmic observation, creating synthetic traditions that will profoundly influence later developments. Recognition that celestial movements correlate with terrestrial cycles leads to worship of sky gods whose favor determines earthly prosperity. Ceremonies that celebrate successful harvests evolve into complex rituals that ensure continued divine benevolence. Sacred narratives that explain natural phenomena develop into mythological systems that provide meaning and purpose for human existence within cosmic frameworks. The feathered serpent imagery that appears in these early artistic traditions represents more than mere decorative motifs. It embodies profound theological concepts that unite earth and sky, human and divine, temporal and eternal. Serpents that symbolize Earth's fertility combine with birds that represent celestial power to create composite deities whose influence encompasses all aspects of existence. The artistic representations of these supernatural beings evolve from simple combinations towards sophisticated iconographic systems that encode complex religious concepts in visual forms. Shamanic practices that provide access to spiritual realms where gods and ancestors dwell become increasingly important as societies grow more complex and face greater challenges. Specialists who master techniques for inducing trance states gain ability to communicate with supernatural forces, their visions providing guidance for both individual and collective decisions. The plant medicines that enable these spiritual journeys become sacred substances whose use requires careful training and ritual preparation. Marriage customs that strengthen alliances between settlements create kinship networks that facilitate both trade and mutual defense. Families whose daughters marry into distant villages gain trading partners while establishing obligations for mutual assistance during crises. The bride prices that accompany such unions often include exotic goods that demonstrate the groom's family's wealth and connections, their value reflecting not mere material worth, but symbolic significance that binds settlements together through reciprocal obligations. Funerary practices that honor deceased leaders, while disposing of their remains in ways that prevent contamination, reveal growing sophistication in both religious thought and public health management. Burial customs that preserve the bodies of important individuals while surrounding them with goods they will need in afterlife create treasure deposits that reflect emerging hierarchies among the living. The offerings that accompany such burials, jade ornaments, ceramic vessels, food supplies, provide evidence of belief systems that envision continued existence beyond physical death. Craft specialization emerges as agricultural surplus enables support for full-time artisans, creating professional classes whose skills far exceed what part-time practitioners can achieve. The potter who spends every day working with clay develops techniques and aesthetic sensibilities that amateur ceramicists cannot match. The carver who devotes his entire attention to working stone or wood creates masterpieces that become treasured possessions passed down through generations. These specialists form the foundation upon which later civilizations will build their greatest achievements. Trade languages that develop to facilitate communication between groups speaking different dialects create lingua francas that enable exchange of ideas as well as goods. The merchants who master multiple languages become intermediaries whose influence extends far beyond mere commercial transactions. Their ability to translate not only words, but also concepts enables the spread of innovations between villages that might otherwise remain isolated in their local traditions. Mathematical concepts that develop from practical needs such as measuring fields, calculating yields, and tracking trade exchanges create intellectual frameworks that will support later developments in astronomy, architecture, and administration. Recognition that numerical relationships govern natural phenomena leads to understanding of principles that enable prediction and control of natural forces. These mathematical insights provide tools that transform human beings from passive victims of natural forces into active agents capable of shaping their environment. As the centuries progress towards 1600 BC, these scattered innovations and developments begin to coalesce into patterns that will define Olmec civilization. Agricultural surplus that enables craft specialization creates conditions for monumental architecture. Trade networks that connect distant regions provide access to materials and ideas that enable unprecedented achievements. Religious concepts that unite earth and sky provide ideological frameworks that justify royal authority. Technological knowledge that accumulates through generations of experimentation provides capabilities that will astonish the ancient world. The stage stands prepared for the transformation that will create Mesoamerica's first true civilization. Agricultural foundations that support dense populations exist. Craft traditions that enable monumental expression flourish. Trade networks that connect distant regions function smoothly. Religious concepts that unite diverse populations around shared beliefs spread throughout the region. Technological capabilities that enable unprecedented achievements accumulate in workshops where master craftsmen train apprentices who will surpass their teachers' accomplishments. all awaits only the emergence of leaders with vision grand enough to harness these accumulated capabilities in service of ambitions that transcend local boundaries. Those leaders prepare to make their entrance upon the stage of history, their names still unknown, but their destiny written in the rich earth of the Gulf Coast lowlands, in the skilled hands of craftsmen whose masterpieces will outlast empires, and in the dreams of peoples who stand ready to build monuments that will proclaim their achievements to a world that has never before witnessed such magnificence rising from the jungles of the New World. The sky hangs low and heavy over waters that have carried the same brown silt for thousands of years, their slow currents now drifting past something never before seen on Earth. Where once only jungle grew beside the Coatzacoalcos River, an artificial mountain rises 30 feet above the surrounding floodplains, its slopes carved into terraces that defy the natural contours of the landscape. This is San Lorenzo, the first true city in the Americas, built through generations of labor that moved millions of basket loads of earth to create a platform that elevates human ambition above the realm of flood and storm. The achievement staggers any observer who understands the magnitude of what has been accomplished. Stone blocks weighing 15 tons each rest upon earthen foundations that required the coordinated effort of thousands of workers moving countless tons of soil from distant locations. Basalt quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, 60 miles through jungle paths, arrives at construction sites through human labor alone. No wheels, no beasts of burden, only the collective will of a people determined to build something that will outlast their bones. Ramps carved into the platform's sides still bear the wear marks of log rollers that transported massive stones up grades that challenge even modern engineering principles. The logistics required to move monuments of such scale across landscapes that flood seasonally while maintaining structural integrity reveals planning capabilities that span generations. Fathers who began this work died, knowing their sons would continue, and those sons labored with confidence that their children would complete what no single lifetime could accomplish. Along the Coatzacoalcos, dugout canoes loaded with tribute arrive in steady procession throughout the trading season. Paddlers who navigate these currents carry more than goods. They transport the acknowledgement of San Lorenzo's growing dominance over territories that extend far beyond the immediate vicinity. Salt from coastal lagoons, jade from highland sources, obsidian from volcanic peaks, and cacao from distant groves flow toward the artificial mountain, like offerings to gods made manifest in stone and earth. The colossal heads that emerge from workshops carved into the plateau's slopes represent perhaps the most stunning achievement of ancient American art. 8 of these monuments, each carved from single basalt blocks, display individual facial features that suggest portraiture rather than generic representation. The sculptors who created these masterpieces worked with tools of stone and wood to achieve results that would challenge modern craftsmen equipped with steel implements. Each head bears unique characteristics, different headdresses, distinct facial features, varying expressions that suggest individual personalities, captured in stone harder than iron. The largest stands nearly 10 feet high and weighs approximately 25 tons, its features rendered with such precision that every line speaks of artistic mastery, honed through generations of accumulated knowledge. These are not primitive carvings, but sophisticated works that demonstrate aesthetic principles as refined as any produced in the ancient world. The process of creating such monuments required not merely artistic skill, but engineering knowledge that enabled transportation and positioning of finished works. Evidence suggests that sculptors carved these portraits near their final locations, understanding that moving completed pieces would present challenges that might prove insurmountable. The workshops where this labor occurred become sacred spaces where human skill merges with divine inspiration to produce art that transcends mere craft. Water flows through San Lorenzo via systems that demonstrate hydraulic engineering principles unknown to contemporary civilizations elsewhere in the Americas. Stone-lined drains snake beneath paved courtyards, their gradients calculated to ensure proper flow while preventing erosion that could undermine structural foundations. The source of water arrives through aqueducts that carry fresh supplies from highland springs, creating urban amenities that support populations far larger than natural resources alone could sustain. The drain system incorporates features that suggest understanding of pressure, differentials, and fluid dynamics that European engineers would not master for another millennium. Covered channels prevent contamination while maintaining access for cleaning and repair. The integration of these utilities into monumental architecture creates urban infrastructure that serves both practical needs and ceremonial requirements without compromising either function. Reservoirs carved into bedrock store water during abundant seasons while providing security during droughts that periodically challenge agricultural systems throughout the region. The construction of these facilities required removal of thousands of tons of stone, using tools that leave distinctive marks still visible in abandoned quarries. The precision of this excavation work demonstrates mastery of stone-cutting techniques that enable architectural achievements previously impossible in Mesoamerica. Workshops scattered throughout the settlement produce artifacts that reveal the sophistication of San Lorenzo's material culture. Jade ornaments carved with precision that requires tools sharper than surgical instruments display artistic motifs that encode complex religious concepts. The techniques required to drill holes through material harder than steel, using hollow reed drills filled with abrasive sand, represent technological achievements that rival anything accomplished in the ancient world. Ceramic vessels discovered in elite compounds display artistic sophistication that transforms utilitarian objects into works of aesthetic excellence. The potters who created these masterpieces understood glazing techniques that produced surfaces smooth as polished metal while maintaining complete waterproofing. Firing temperatures achieved in kilns, built without modern materials, produce colors and textures that contemporary ceramicists struggle to replicate using advanced equipment. Figurines that blend human and animal characteristics reveal religious concepts that will influence Mesoamerican thought for millennia to come. These were jaguars, combine infant features with feline fangs, human intelligence with supernatural power, mortality with divine authority. The theological implications of such imagery suggest developed concepts of transformation that justify royal claims to divine sanction through demonstrated ability to communicate with supernatural forces. Magnetic mirrors polished from magnetite ore reflect more than physical appearances. They serve as windows into spiritual realms where ancestors dwell and gods observe mortal actions. The creation of such objects requires knowledge of mineral properties and grinding techniques that produce surfaces reflective enough to serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. The symbolic significance of these mirrors extends throughout Olmec culture, their presence in burials suggesting beliefs about soul travel and divine communication. Ball courts carved into the platform's slopes echo with activities that merge athletic competition with religious ceremony. The rubber balls used in these games bounce with elasticity that seems almost supernatural to observers unfamiliar with processed latex. Players whose skill enables them to maintain control, using only hips and shoulders, demonstrate physical abilities that border on the extraordinary, while enacting cosmic dramas that reenact struggles between fundamental forces. The courts themselves display architectural features that enhance acoustic properties, enabling spectators throughout the facility to hear sounds produced by balls striking playing surfaces. This attention to sensory experience suggests that games served purposes beyond mere entertainment. They create total environments where physical action combines with spiritual meaning to produce transformative experiences for participants and observers alike. Markets that operate on lower terraces attract merchants from across Mesoamerica, their goods demonstrating San Lorenzo's growing influence over commercial networks that span vast territories. Obsidian blades whose edges remain sharper than modern steel, after centuries in the earth, arrive from volcanic sources hundreds of miles distant. Exotic shells that preserve the ocean's whisper travel from coastlines where different peoples worship different gods, yet acknowledge the power that emanates from this artificial mountain. The standardization, evident in weights and measures used throughout these markets, reveals administrative sophistication that enables complex commercial relationships between peoples, speaking different languages and following different customs. Cacao beans that serve as currency maintain consistent sizes and qualities that facilitate transactions across cultural boundaries. The regulatory mechanisms that ensure honest dealing create commercial environments where trust enables exchanges that might otherwise prove impossible. Elite residences that cluster around the Great Platform display architectural features that demonstrate both wealth and artistic sophistication. Courtyards paved with stones fitted so precisely that knife blades cannot penetrate their joints create outdoor spaces suitable for ceremonial activities that require perfect surfaces. Drainage systems that remove rainwater without creating erosion problems enable construction of permanent structures in landscapes that experience both devastating floods and extended droughts. The distribution of luxury goods throughout these compounds reveals social hierarchies that extend far beyond simple wealth accumulation. Jade ornaments whose value derives from spiritual rather than economic significance mark their wearers as individuals whose authority transcends mere material success. The controlled distribution of such items suggests political systems that regulate access to sacred materials through mechanisms that reinforce legitimate authority while preventing unauthorized claims to divine sanction. Storage facilities carved into bedrock preserve not merely agricultural surplus, but collections of exotic goods that represent wealth accumulation on unprecedented scales. Granaries, whose contents could feed thousands for months, create security against crop failures, while enabling support for non-agricultural specialists whose skills contribute to urban prosperity. The techniques used to protect stored materials from moisture and pests reflect accumulated knowledge that transforms abundance into lasting advantage. Beyond agricultural storage, these facilities house collections of raw materials that enable artistic and technological achievements impossible for societies dependent upon local resources alone. Jade from Guatemala, obsidian from central Mexico, shells from both Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The diversity of materials available to San Lorenzo's craftsmen enables creative expressions that transcend regional limitations, while establishing artistic standards that influence development throughout Mesoamerica. San Lorenzo's influence extends through networks that carry both goods and ideas across distances that span the known world of ancient America. Olmec-style artifacts appear in sites from central Mexico to the Pacific coast, their presence indicating either direct contact or indirect influence that spreads artistic motifs and religious concepts far from their points of origin. The mechanisms that enable such cultural transmission create foundations for future developments that will unite diverse peoples around shared symbols and beliefs. Diplomatic relationships implied by the distribution of prestige goods create political networks that extend San Lorenzo's authority through alliance and intimidation rather than direct conquest. Local leaders who accept Olmec overlordship receive access to luxury items that enhance their own prestige, while acknowledging superior power. The delicate balance required to maintain such relationships demands diplomatic skills that rival those developed by more famous ancient civilizations. Religious practices centered around the ceremonial complex create shared experiences that unite diverse populations, while reinforcing social hierarchies that justify elite privilege. Bloodletting rituals, where leaders pierce their own flesh with obsidian lancets, demonstrate royal willingness to sacrifice for collective welfare, while asserting exclusive access to divine communication. The elaborate paraphernalia required for such ceremonies, jade bloodletters, bark paper for catching sacred drops, copal incense for carrying prayers skyward, creates demand for luxury goods that supports craft specialists while maintaining religious authority. Astronomical knowledge preserved in architectural alignments demonstrates sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that enable accurate prediction of seasonal changes crucial for agricultural success. The orientations of major structures correspond to solar positions at dates significant for farming communities, whose prosperity depends upon precise timing of planting and harvest activities. This ability to predict optimal agricultural schedules creates authority that extends throughout surrounding regions, where local leaders depend upon such knowledge for their own success. The calendar systems created through these astronomical observations provide frameworks for organizing both practical activities and ceremonial obligations that unite scattered communities around shared temporal rhythms. Festivals that celebrate successful harvests coincide with celestial events that demonstrate divine approval of human actions. The priests who master such complex knowledge gain influence that transcends regional boundaries, while serving rulers whose authority derives from demonstrated ability to maintain cosmic harmony. Yet even as San Lorenzo reaches unprecedented heights of prosperity and influence, forces begin to gather that will challenge the foundations upon which this first American civilization rests. The site begins to experience difficulties around 1200 BC, though the exact nature of these challenges remains mysterious. Some colossal heads show evidence of deliberate mutilation, their faces scarred by impacts that seem intentional rather than accidental. It's still unclear what led to San Lorenzo's downfall around 900 BC, and the question continues to baffle those trying to understand why a major city would be abandoned. Climate changes that alter rainfall patterns might threaten agricultural systems upon which dense populations depend. Political upheavals that accompany rapid social change could destabilize institutions that maintain order among diverse groups with competing interests. Signs of violence emerge in San Lorenzo's final centuries, but it's still uncertain whether they point to an outside attack, a civil uprising, or some kind of ceremonial destruction. Some monuments bear signs of systematic defacement that suggest political rather than random vandalism. The care with which certain sculptures are damaged implies knowledge of their symbolic significance. Enemies who understand what they destroy achieve greater impact than those who strike blindly. Whatever forces ultimately overwhelm San Lorenzo, the city's achievements establish precedents that will influence Mesoamerican development for millennia to come. The artistic standards demonstrated in colossal sculpture create aesthetic principles that guide future generations of craftsmen. The urban planning that enables dense populations to thrive in challenging environments provides models for later cities that face similar problems. The political innovations that unite diverse peoples under centralized authority offer solutions that future rulers will adapt to their own circumstances. The monuments that survive San Lorenzo's political collapse continue to proclaim the achievements of its builders long after the civilization that created them fades into memory. Colossal heads that once gazed upon thriving plazas now stare across abandoned terraces where jungle slowly reclaims artificial mountains built by human ambition. Yet their stone features preserve the memory of an age when gods walked among mortals, and mortals dared to build homes worthy of divine attention. As San Lorenzo's influence wanes, other centers begin to assert claims to leadership of the cultural tradition it established. Venta, rising in the wetlands farther east, inherits both the challenges and opportunities that San Lorenzo's decline creates. The artistic achievements and political innovations pioneered on the artificial mountain provide foundations upon which new rulers will attempt to build even greater monuments to human achievement guided by divine inspiration. From the quiet wetlands, vapor curls above the Tonela's winding course, its mirrored surface catching the image of pyramids that thrust skyward, ancient prayers frozen in clay and stone. Here at La Venta, where the earth itself appears sacred and every hillock suggests supernatural significance, the greatest ceremonial center in ancient America takes shape through generations of labor, guided by visions that transcend mortal understanding. The massive earthen pyramid that dominates this sacred geography rises 110 feet above surrounding marshes, its slopes oriented toward cardinal directions, with precision that demonstrates mastery of astronomical knowledge accumulated across centuries of patient observation. The Great Pyramid stands as testimony to engineering capabilities that transform humble clay into monuments rivaling anything built in the ancient world. Workers carry millions of basket loads of earth up ramps that spiral around the growing structure, their labor coordinated through planning systems that span decades of construction. Each layer of clay receives careful preparation, mixing with sand to prevent cracking, compacting to ensure stability, shaping to achieve slopes that will endure millennia of tropical storms. The final form emerges as a perfect truncated cone whose geometry reflects cosmic principles that unite earthly architecture with heavenly order. Underground, in chambers carved from bedrock, beneath the pyramid's massive weight, royal burials preserve treasures that demonstrate wealth accumulation beyond anything previously known in Mesoamerica. Jade masks whose translucent green surfaces seem to glow with inner light transform deceased rulers into supernatural beings whose authority transcends death itself. Serpentine mosaics cover chamber floors in patterns that encode religious mysteries, abstract designs that represent cosmic forces, animal forms that embody divine powers, geometric arrangements that mirror celestial movements. The most spectacular of these underground deposits spans 35 feet in length and consists of nearly 500 carefully placed serpentine blocks arranged to form a massive jaguar mask. This mosaic, buried immediately after completion and never intended for mortal eyes, serves purposes that transcend human appreciation. Its creation required months of planning, selection of precisely colored stones, and execution by craftsmen whose skill enables them to transform individual pieces into unified images that capture divine essence in mineral form. Jade burial offerings surround royal remains with collections that represent the accumulated wealth of generations. Necklaces whose beads required years to carve and polish encircle necks that will never again speak commands to living subjects. Ceremonial bloodletters whose obsidian edges enabled communication with gods rest beside hands that once held authority over territories spanning hundreds of miles. The quantities of precious materials placed in these tombs demonstrate not merely royal wealth, but theological concepts that envision continued existence requiring earthly treasures. Above ground, stelae and altars create galleries of stone sculpture that establish artistic standards for Mesoamerican civilization. Complex 3 depicts a ruler whose elaborate headdress incorporates symbols of divine authority, while his posture demonstrates the dignity appropriate to one who serves as intermediary between mortal and immortal realms. The relief carving that covers every surface of this monument displays technical mastery that enables artists to capture subtle details of costume, gesture, and facial expression in stone harder than steel. Altar 4 presents scenes of royal ceremony that encode political relationships within religious symbolism. The ruler who emerges from a cave mouth holds an infant whose significance transcends simple family relationships. This child represents dynastic continuity, divine favor, and cosmic renewal combined in single human form. The umbilical cord that connects them transforms biological fact into theological statement, demonstrating that royal authority flows through bloodlines sanctified by supernatural forces. The throne-like altars that dot Venta's ceremonial plazas serve as stages for performances that transform political authority into religious drama. Rulers who seat themselves upon these carved monuments assume positions that elevate them above ordinary mortality, while providing platforms for ceremonies that demonstrate divine favor. The iconography that decorates these seats of power combines jaguar symbolism with human features, creating composite images that justify claims to supernatural sanction through artistic representation of theological concepts. Colossal Monument 1, the largest sculpture at Venta, presents a ruler whose features combine individual portraiture with idealized divine characteristics. Standing over 9 feet tall and weighing approximately 20 tons, this monument required coordinated effort by dozens of workers to transport from distant quarries and position within the ceremonial complex. The artistic achievement it represents exceeds anything previously attempted in stone sculpture. Its surfaces finished to smoothness that rivals polished metal, while maintaining hardness that will preserve royal features across millennia. The ceremonial complex itself demonstrates urban planning principles that integrate astronomical observation with religious requirements to create sacred landscapes that function as cosmic models. The arrangement of pyramids, plazas, and monuments follows orientations that align with celestial events, significant for agricultural calendars, while providing venues for ceremonies that unite scattered populations around shared rituals. Processions that move between these architectural elements create kinetic experiences that transform participants while reinforcing social hierarchies that justify elite privilege. Complex A presents the most sophisticated architectural achievement in pre-Columbian America. Its components arranged to create outdoor spaces suitable for ceremonies that require precise relationships between performers and audiences. The Great Pyramid serves as backdrop for rituals conducted in plazas that can accommodate thousands of participants, while maintaining visual and acoustic connections that enable shared experiences. Smaller mounds that flank the central complex provide elevated positions for elite observers, while creating amphitheater effects that focus attention on ceremonial activities. Drainage systems that control water flow throughout the complex demonstrate hydraulic engineering that serves both practical and symbolic purposes. Channels that carry away seasonal floods also create artificial streams whose movements mirror cosmic rivers that connect earthly realms with celestial domains. The integration of water management with ceremonial architecture produces environments where natural forces become participants in religious dramas rather than obstacles to human activity. The famed buried serpentine pavement stands as one of the most enigmatic creations of its time, its purpose still cloaked in silence. This massive mosaic, created from over 400 tons of precisely cut and polished serpentine blocks, depicts an abstract mask or geometric pattern whose meaning remains hidden from modern interpretation. The investment of labor required to create such work, quarrying stone from sources 200 miles distant, transporting blocks through jungle and swamp, cutting and fitting pieces to tolerances measured in fractions of inches, demonstrates commitment to projects whose purpose transcended any practical consideration. Immediately after completion, workers buried this masterpiece under layers of clay and sand, sealing it from human view forever. The ritual significance of such action suggests theological concepts that value creation itself above human appreciation, understanding that divine forces observe achievements that mortal eyes never witness. The ceremonies that accompanied this burial created sacred deposits that sanctify the very ground upon which Venta rises, while establishing precedents for similar offerings throughout Olmec territories. Jade workshops scattered throughout the site produce ornaments whose technical excellence demonstrates mastery of lapidary arts that rival anything achieved in ancient civilizations worldwide. The tools required to work material harder than steel, hollow bone drills filled with abrasive sand, obsidian cutting implements sharper than modern surgical instruments, polishing stones that achieve mirror finishes, represent technological achievements that enable artistic expression previously impossible in Mesoamerica. The iconographic program that emerges from these workshops establishes visual languages that will influence religious art throughout the region for centuries to come. Jaguar imagery that combines human intelligence with feline power creates artistic representations of theological concepts that justify royal claims to divine sanction. The precise symbolism embedded in these carvings, cleft heads that represent supernatural birth, fanged mouths that demonstrate otherworldly power, infant features that suggest innocence combined with wisdom, encodes religious mysteries in forms that transcend linguistic barriers. Ceremonial bloodletting, implements crafted from jade and obsidian, enable rulers to demonstrate their unique relationships with divine forces through rituals that ordinary mortals cannot survive. The technical precision required to create these tools, edges sharp enough to penetrate flesh without shattering, surfaces polished to eliminate contamination, forms designed to facilitate specific ceremonial actions, reflects understanding of both religious requirements and practical necessities that govern sacred activities. Copal incense burned during these ceremonies creates aromatic environments that transport participants beyond ordinary consciousness, while carrying prayers towards celestial realms where gods evaluate human devotion. The preparation of these sacred substances requires knowledge of resin processing that transforms raw tree saps into materials suitable for religious purposes. The smoke that rises from ceremonial fires creates visual representations of communication between earthly and heavenly domains, while producing sensory experiences that enhance spiritual significance of ritual activities. Ball courts carved into Venta's ceremonial complex provide venues for games that merge athletic competition with religious ceremony in ways that transform physical contests into cosmic dramas. The rubber balls used in these games, processed from latex collected in surrounding forests, bounce with elasticity that seems almost supernatural to observers unfamiliar with advanced material technologies. Players whose skill enables them to maintain control using only hips and shoulders, demonstrate physical capabilities that border on the extraordinary, while enacting theological narratives that reenact fundamental struggles between opposing forces. The acoustic properties of these courts enhance sensory experiences by amplifying sounds produced when balls strike playing surfaces or impact with players' bodies. This attention to auditory effects suggests that games served purposes beyond mere entertainment, creating total environments where sound combines with movement to produce transformative experiences for participants and spectators alike. The architectural features that achieve these acoustic effects, sloped walls that reflect sound waves, surface materials that enhance resonance, spatial relationships that focus attention, demonstrate engineering knowledge that serves religious purposes through technical mastery. Trade networks that center on La Venta expand to encompass territories that stretch from central Mexico to the Pacific coast, carrying Olmec artistic motifs and religious concepts to populations that adopt these innovations while adapting them to local conditions. Jade from Guatemalan highlands, obsidian from Mexican volcanoes, shells from both Atlantic and Pacific coastlines. The diversity of materials that flow toward through far-reaching trade networks. This center of power extends its influence beyond regional borders, laying the economic groundwork for cultural dominance. Olmec-style artifacts appear in sites throughout Mesoamerica during La Venta's period of dominance, their presence indicating cultural transmission that operates through mechanisms ranging from direct political control to voluntary adoption of prestigious innovations. Babyface figurines echoing early prototypes, jaguar motifs drawn from sacred Olmec imagery, and structures aligned with celestial patterns first charted in ceremonial centers, all reveal a cultural reach far exceeding the boundaries of direct rule. The transformation of local artistic traditions through contact with Olmec innovations creates hybrid styles that blend foreign influences with indigenous customs to produce new forms of expression that serve regional needs while acknowledging superior cultural authority. Pottery decorated with Olmec motifs, sculpture that incorporates Olmec iconography, ceremonial complexes that follow Olmec architectural principles. These adaptations demonstrate cultural processes that transform isolated regional traditions into interconnected networks that share fundamental aesthetic and religious principles. Rather than relying solely on conquest, the sacred complex cultivates loyalty through a calculated mix of strength and generosity, crafting alliances that endure longer than those won by war. Local rulers who acknowledge Olmec supremacy receive access to luxury goods that enhance their own prestige, while gaining protection from enemies who lack similar powerful alliances. The delicate balance required to maintain such relationships demands diplomatic skills that enable peaceful resolution of conflicts that might otherwise require military intervention. By joining its royal family to ruling houses across the land, La Venta weaves a kinship network that strengthens diplomacy and fuels the sharing of culture and ideas. These unions produce children whose mixed heritage enables them to serve as intermediaries between different populations, while ensuring that Olmec influence penetrates deeply into allied societies. The offspring of such marriages often become rulers in their own right, carrying Olmec customs and religious concepts to territories that might otherwise resist foreign influence. Bearers of sacred knowledge, shaped within the ceremonial Heartland, journey outward to establish ritual centers that echo their origins while embracing the soul of new lands. These missionaries create networks of shared religious practice that transcend political boundaries, while establishing institutional frameworks that can survive temporary disruptions in direct political control. The temples they found become focal points for cultural transformation that operates through spiritual rather than military mechanisms. Calendar systems that coordinate agricultural activities with religious observances throughout Olmec territories create temporal frameworks that unite diverse populations around shared rhythms of work and celebration. The astronomical knowledge required to maintain such calendars, understanding of solar and lunar cycles, ability to predict eclipses and planetary movements, calculation of seasonal variations, represents intellectual achievements that place Olmec civilization among the most sophisticated societies of the ancient world. Festivals that celebrate successful harvests, mark significant astronomical events, or commemorate important historical anniversaries, become occasions for regional gatherings that reinforce political relationships while providing opportunities for cultural exchange. These celebrations attract participants from throughout Olmec spheres of influence, creating temporary communities that demonstrate the unity underlying apparent diversity while establishing precedents for larger political integration. Though not yet fully formed, writing systems begin to appear under the influence of the ceremonial Heartland. Early attempts to immortalize thought and order, destined to be perfected by later hands. The Cascajal block symbols, arranged in patterns that suggest systematic recording of information rather than random decoration. Whether these markings represent true writing or preliminary steps toward literacy remains debated, but their existence demonstrates intellectual development that approaches one of civilization's most crucial innovations: record-keeping systems that enable administration of increasingly complex political and economic relationships, require methods for preserving information that transcend the limitations of human memory. The development of symbolic notation that can record numerical quantities, preserve historical events, or communicate across linguistic barriers represents technological achievement that enables governance of territories too large for direct personal supervision. Across a broad and diverse landscape, authority is maintained through communication networks that bind the farthest reaches to the core, ensuring no command is delayed. Messenger networks that carry official correspondence along established routes create governmental capabilities that enable coordinated policy implementation across distances that would otherwise fragment political unity. The roads that support such communication also facilitate commercial exchange that strengthens economic foundations for political integration. Craft specialization that reaches unprecedented levels during Venta's dominance creates professional classes whose skills enable artistic and technological achievements impossible for societies dependent upon part-time artisans. Master sculptors, whose entire careers focus on monument creation, develop techniques that enable them to achieve results that amateur carvers cannot match. The workshops where they train apprentices become repositories of accumulated knowledge that preserve and transmit technical expertise across generations. Through structured paths of learning, the next generation of administrators, ritual leaders, and artisans are shaped, ensuring that the wisdom at the heart of Olmec life endures and grows. Schools attached to ceremonial complexes provide formal instruction in astronomical observation, religious doctrine, and administrative procedures that government requires. The graduates of such institutions carry standardized knowledge to peripheral regions, where they establish uniform practices that strengthen political integration while maintaining cultural coherence. Grounded in hands-on experience and careful observation, Olmec healing traditions evolve into a body of knowledge capable of saving lives where others would falter. The understanding of medicinal plants, surgical procedures, and diagnostic techniques that characterizes Olmec. Medical practice represents scientific achievement that serves practical purposes while supporting religious concepts that view healing as divine intervention channeled through human agency. At its height, around 600 BC, the site stands as enduring proof that when faith and innovation unite, human societies can produce wonders equal to any known in antiquity. The Great Pyramid that dominates the ceremonial landscape proclaims royal authority that transcends mortal limitations while demonstrating engineering capabilities that enable construction of monuments whose scale approaches the supernatural. At the height of Olmec influence, the seeds of disruption begin to stir, setting in motion challenges that will shake the pillars of their world. Environmental changes that alter rainfall patterns threaten agricultural systems that support dense urban populations. Political tensions that arise from success itself create conflicts between competing visions of how divine authority should be exercised. Social pressures that accompany rapid expansion strain traditional institutions beyond their capacity to maintain effective governance. The monuments that proclaim eternal glory begin to show signs of the mortality that affects all human achievements. Some sculptures bear evidence of deliberate damage that suggests political upheaval rather than natural decay. The careful burial of certain ceremonial objects indicates ritual closure that marks the end of one age and preparation for whatever transformation awaits beyond the horizon of current understanding. Around 400 BC, Venta joins San Lorenzo in gradual abandonment that leaves magnificent ceremonial complexes to the jungle and the rain. The reasons for this decline remain as mysterious as those that caused San Lorenzo's earlier collapse. But the pattern suggests fundamental challenges that Olmec civilization proves unable to overcome, despite its remarkable achievements in art, architecture, and social organization. Deep in caves where sunlight never penetrates and silence weighs heavy as stone, shamans descend through limestone passages toward chambers where gods dwell beneath the earth's surface. Water drips from stalactites like tears of celestial beings, while phosphorescent minerals gleam in torchlight that flickers across walls carved by underground rivers older than human memory. Here, in these netherworld sanctuaries, where ordinary mortals fear to venture, the most powerful priests undergo transformations that blur boundaries between human and divine, mortal flesh and immortal spirit. The journey into these sacred depths requires preparations that begin at childhood, for those chosen to serve as intermediaries between earthly rulers and supernatural forces. Young initiates learn to navigate underground passages without light, memorizing routes through limestone labyrinths, where wrong turns lead to chambers from which no explorer returns. Their training includes fasting that weakens physical bodies while strengthening spiritual perception, meditation techniques that enable communication with entities dwelling in realm beyond normal consciousness, sacred mushrooms that grow in cave mouths where darkness meets twilight, provide gateways to visions that reveal divine will to those brave enough to consume them. The priests who gather these mystical fungi understand precisely when psychoactive compounds reach peak potency, which varieties produce specific types of spiritual experience, how preparation methods affect the intensity and duration of otherworldly journeys. Their knowledge transforms biological accident into theological instrument, random fungal growth into sacrament that enables mortal beings to commune directly with gods. The transformations that occur during these chemically induced trances create beings whose nature transcends ordinary humanity. Shamans whose consciousness travels to celestial realms, while their bodies remain in earthly caves, return with knowledge that enables them to predict weather patterns, diagnose illnesses, and interpret divine commands that guide royal decisions. Their reports describe encounters with supernatural entities whose forms blend human intelligence with animal power, creating composite beings that embody the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity. Jaguar imagery that dominates Olmec religious art captures the essence of these shamanic transformations in visual forms that communicate theological concepts to audiences who cannot directly experience divine encounters. The infant faces that blend innocence with supernatural knowledge represent souls at the moment of contact with divine forces, their features transformed by powers that ordinary mortals cannot comprehend. Fanged mouths that suggest predatory capabilities demonstrate that divine favor includes destructive as well as creative aspects, blessing and curse combined in single supernatural beings. Cleft heads that mark these supernatural entities indicate birth through supernatural rather than natural processes, divine intervention that creates beings whose nature transcends biological limitations. The V-shaped indentations that appear on figurines, masks, and monumental sculptures represent wounds that open human consciousness to divine influence, while marking their bearers as individuals whose authority derives from direct communication with gods rather than mere earthly achievement. In ceremonial plazas where thousands gather during festivals that mark seasonal transitions, dancers whose bodies bear jaguar markings perform rituals that reenact mythological events while invoking divine powers that control fertility, rainfall, and agricultural success. Their movements, practiced through years of training that begins in childhood, encode meanings that transform entertainment into religious drama while providing instruction in cosmic principles that govern natural cycles. The costumes that transform dancers into supernatural beings require materials gathered from throughout Mesoamerica and processed through techniques that preserve spiritual as well as physical properties. Jaguar pelts whose spots mirror star patterns enable performers to embody celestial forces while remaining anchored to earthly realities. Feathered headdresses that incorporate plumes from birds dwelling at different altitudes create vertical connections between underworld, earth surface, and sky realms that priests navigate during spiritual journeys. Masks carved from jade, whose translucent green surfaces seem to glow with inner light, enable wearers to assume identities that transcend individual personality while accessing powers that ordinary humans cannot control. The technical precision required to create these sacred implements, hollow eye sockets that align perfectly with human vision, breathing holes that enable extended wear, weight distribution that prevents fatigue during lengthy ceremonies, demonstrates understanding of both spiritual requirements and practical necessities that govern religious activities. Blood sacrifice that flows from royal veins during public ceremonies creates bonds between earthly rulers and heavenly powers that cannot be achieved through lesser offerings. The obsidian lancets that enable these rituals possess edges sharper than modern surgical instruments, while maintaining symbolic significance that transforms physical pain into spiritual communication. Royal bloodletting demonstrates divine favor through willingness to endure suffering, while asserting exclusive access to supernatural forces that ordinary mortals cannot approach. The bark paper that catches sacred drops during these ceremonies burns with flames that carry prayers directly towards celestial realms where gods evaluate human devotion. Smoke that rises from blood-soaked offerings creates visible connections between earthly and heavenly domains, while producing aromatic environments that enhance spiritual significance of ritual activities. The preparation of these combustible materials requires knowledge of plant processing that transforms ordinary tree bark into substances suitable for sacred purposes. Underground chambers carved beneath ceremonial pyramids provide venues for rituals that require complete isolation from ordinary consciousness. The priests who conduct ceremonies in these netherworld sanctuaries understand acoustic properties that enable whispered prayers to resonate through stone passages, while maintaining secrecy that protects sacred knowledge from unauthorized access. Water that seeps through limestone walls creates soundscapes that enhance meditative states, while providing auditory connections to underground rivers that flow toward oceanic infinities. Child sacrifice, though performed rarely and with elaborate ritual preparation, creates ultimate demonstrations of royal devotion while transforming innocent victims into divine messengers whose souls carry earthly concerns directly to celestial councils. The infants chosen for these supreme offerings receive treatment that elevates them above ordinary mortality, bathing in sacred waters, anointing with precious oils, decoration with jade ornaments whose value exceeds that of royal regalia. The ceremonies that precede such sacrifices create community experiences that unite participants in shared responsibility, while reinforcing social hierarchies that justify elite privilege through demonstrated willingness to make ultimate sacrifices for collective welfare. Processions that carry chosen children through ceremonial complexes enable thousands of witnesses to participate in rituals whose significance transcends individual understanding, while creating memories that bind communities together through shared experience of the sacred. Burials that follow these sacrifices surround small bodies with treasures whose quantity and quality demonstrate the sacred significance of transformed lives. Jade ornaments, obsidian tools, ceramic vessels, and exotic shells create underwater palaces suitable for souls whose earthly existence ended in divine service. The underground chambers that house these offerings become shrines where future generations can commune with sanctified spirits while seeking intervention in earthly affairs. Ball games that merge athletic competition with cosmic drama create ritualized conflicts that reenact fundamental struggles between opposing forces while providing venues for divine intervention in human affairs. The courts where these contests unfold amplify sounds produced when rubber spheres strike playing surfaces, creating acoustic environments that enhance spiritual significance of physical activities. Players whose skills enable them to control balls using only hips and shoulders demonstrate mastery that borders on supernatural, while enacting mythological narratives that encode theological wisdom. The rubber balls themselves, processed from latex collected in sacred groves where trees bleed white tears when properly incised, bounce with elasticity that seems almost supernatural to observers unfamiliar with advanced material technologies. The transformation of liquid tree sap into solid spheres that defy gravity through their resilience represents technological achievement that serves religious purposes while demonstrating human mastery over natural forces through divine guidance. Cosmic geography that underlies Olmec religious thought divides existence into three interconnected realms, whose boundaries remain permeable to beings possessed of sufficient spiritual power. The underworld where ancestors dwell, and from which agricultural fertility emerges, represents foundation upon which earthly existence rests. The sky realm, where gods control weather patterns and celestial movements, provides overarching authority that governs terrestrial activities. The Earth's surface, where humans conduct their brief existence, serves as battlefield, where cosmic forces interact through mortal agents. Sacred directions that orient ceremonial architecture create spatial frameworks that enable ritual activities to achieve cosmic significance through proper alignment with supernatural forces. East, where sun rises daily to renew cosmic order, represents rebirth and divine renewal that conquers darkness through celestial intervention. West, where solar journeys end in daily deaths that precede underground passage toward dawn's return, symbolizes transformation and spiritual passage that enables communication between living and dead. North and south create axis that connects polar extremes, while providing directional guidance for souls traveling between earthly existence and otherworldly destinations. The ceremonial complexes that align with these cardinal points become cosmic models that enable earthly activities to achieve heavenly significance through proper orientation toward divine forces that control natural cycles. Calendar systems that coordinate religious observances with agricultural activities create temporal frameworks that unite human labor with cosmic rhythms while ensuring that earthly activities receive divine approval through proper timing. The astronomical knowledge required to maintain such calendars represents intellectual achievement that places shamanic specialists among the most learned individuals in ancient America, while providing practical guidance that ensures agricultural success through spiritual intervention. Solar observations that track daily movements across Sky Dome enable prediction of seasonal changes that govern planting and harvest schedules, while providing cosmic validation for royal authority through demonstrated ability to communicate with celestial forces. The priests who master such calculations gain influence that extends throughout territories where agricultural success depends upon accurate prediction of optimal timing for farming activities. Lunar cycles that govern ceremonial calendars create rhythmic patterns that coordinate ritual activities with natural phenomena, while enabling priests to demonstrate divine favor through successful prediction of celestial events. Eclipse calculations that enable anticipation of spectacular celestial dramas provide opportunities for shamanic specialists to demonstrate supernatural knowledge while creating community experiences that reinforce religious authority through apparent control over cosmic forces. Venus observations that track morning and evening star appearances enable correlation of celestial movements with terrestrial activities, while providing astronomical frameworks for organizing both religious and political calendars. The mathematical precision required for such calculations demonstrates intellectual sophistication that rivals achievements of more famous ancient civilizations, while serving practical purposes that justify investment in astronomical education. Mythological narratives that explain natural phenomena through stories of divine intervention create theological frameworks that provide meaning and purpose for human existence within cosmic order, while establishing precedents for ritual activities that maintain harmony between earthly and heavenly realms. The tales that describe supernatural beings whose adventures create geographical features, establish cultural practices, and determine seasonal cycles become foundational literature that preserves religious wisdom in memorable forms. Creation stories that describe emergence of current world from previous cosmic cycles establish temporal frameworks that place human existence within larger patterns of cosmic renewal, while providing theological justification for ritual activities that ensure continued divine favor. The narrative structures that organize these tales encode astronomical knowledge within entertainment that makes complex concepts accessible to audiences who lack formal education in mathematical principles. Hero myths that celebrate adventures of supernatural beings who overcome cosmic enemies provide moral guidance while establishing behavioral models that ordinary humans should emulate in their relationships with divine forces. The protagonists of these stories demonstrate virtues that enable success in spiritual endeavors, while warning against character flaws that lead to divine disfavor and earthly catastrophe. Shamanic journeys that enable living priests to travel through otherworldly realms provide eyewitness accounts of supernatural geography, while gathering intelligence about divine intentions that affect earthly activities. The techniques that enable such spiritual travel require years of training that begins in childhood with dietary restrictions, meditation practices, and gradual exposure to psychoactive substances that open consciousness to non-ordinary realities. The guides who accompany novice shamans during their first journeys to otherworldly realms provide protection against spiritual dangers, while ensuring that inexperienced travelers return safely to ordinary consciousness, with useful knowledge rather than madness that destroys their capacity for further service. Animal spirits that appear during these visions provide instruction in cosmic principles, while establishing personal relationships between individual shamans and supernatural protectors who guide their future spiritual development. Sacred plants that enable access to divine realms grow in specific locations that become pilgrimage destinations, where shamanic specialists gather materials for religious ceremonies, while renewing their own spiritual connections through direct contact with natural sources of supernatural power. The knowledge required to identify, harvest, and prepare these botanical sacraments represents scientific achievement that serves religious purposes, while demonstrating human capacity to cooperate with natural forces through proper understanding of ecological relationships. Divination practices that enable prediction of future events through interpretation of supernatural signs provide practical guidance for royal decisions, while demonstrating priestly access to divine knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. The methods used for such fortune-telling include examination of animal entrails, interpretation of dream imagery, observation of unusual natural phenomena, and consultation with spirit entities contacted through shamanic trance states. Oracle locations that provide venues for divine communication become regional pilgrimage destinations, where individuals seeking supernatural guidance can consult with shamanic specialists whose training enables them to interpret divine messages while providing practical advice for solving earthly problems. The ceremonies that precede such consultations create ritual environments that enhance spiritual receptivity, while ensuring that divine communications achieve maximum clarity and accuracy. Healing practices that restore health through spiritual intervention create medical technologies that serve physical needs while demonstrating divine favor toward individuals whose suffering receives supernatural attention. The techniques used by shamanic healers include extraction of spiritual objects that cause illness, restoration of soul parts that have been stolen by malevolent entities, and communication with plant spirits that provide guidance for herbal treatments. The diagnostic methods that enable shamanic healers to identify causes of illness include examination of patients' spiritual condition through techniques that reveal supernatural influences affecting physical health, while providing guidance for therapeutic interventions that address spiritual as well as physical aspects of disease. Such holistic approaches to medical treatment create healing systems that achieve results beyond those possible through purely physical interventions. Protective rituals that shield individuals and communities from supernatural threats create defensive technologies that enable human societies to thrive despite constant exposure to spiritual dangers that could destroy unprepared populations. The ceremonies that establish such protection require precise execution of complex procedures while maintaining spiritual purity that ensures divine cooperation in defensive efforts. Sacred bundles that preserve ritual implements between ceremonial occasions create portable shrines that enable shamanic specialists to conduct religious activities in locations distant from permanent ceremonial centers, while maintaining access to supernatural powers that ordinary materials cannot contain. The objects contained within such bundles, crystals that focus spiritual energy, bones that connect with ancestral powers, shells that channel oceanic forces, represent accumulated spiritual capital that enables their possessors to perform miraculous feats. As Olmec religious traditions reach full development during the height of ceremonial center construction, they create theological frameworks that will influence Mesoamerican spiritual thought for millennia to come. The concepts that emerge from shamanic experiences, transformation between human and animal states, communication with supernatural entities, ritual manipulation of cosmic forces, establish precedents that later civilizations will elaborate, while maintaining fundamental insights that Olmec visionaries discovered through their courageous exploration of spiritual realms beyond ordinary consciousness. Dawn breaks over the Usumacinta River as jade merchants from Guatemala paddle their dugout canoes toward markets that will determine the wealth of kingdoms. Their cargo holds green stone so precious that a single carved mask commands the tribute of entire villages. Obsidian blades sharper than any metal known to ancient peoples, and rubber balls that bounce with supernatural elasticity. These traders follow routes established by their grandfathers, yet they carry more than goods. They transport the cultural DNA of a civilization whose influence now extends from the Pacific coast to the Valley of Mexico. At Chalcatzingo, where massive boulders provide natural canvases for ancient artists, sculptors carve reliefs that blend mountain mythology with lowland theology in ways that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The cave paintings they create show rulers emerging from supernatural portals, while supernatural jaguars hover overhead, their clawed feet touching earth and sky simultaneously. These images speak a visual language learned from Venta masters, yet they serve indigenous spiritual needs that transform borrowed concepts into native expressions of divine authority. The Morelos Valley merchants who commission these works wear jade ear flares carved in wetland civilization studios, their distinctive green glow proclaiming participation in networks that span half a continent. When they speak, their voices carry the confidence of men who understand that wealth flows toward those who control its channels. Their pottery displays motifs that any Venta priest would recognize, were jaguar faces, cleft-headed infants, feathered serpents whose coils encode cosmic mysteries. In Guerrero caves, where darkness swallows torchlight after a few paces, artists work precious stone with tools and methods that reveal training received from masters whose expertise originated beside tropical rivers hundreds of miles distant. Their obsidian scrapers cut jade with precision that would astound modern craftsmen, while their drilling implements, hollow bird bones filled with abrasive sand, create perfectly round holes through material harder than steel. The masks they produce transform area chiefs into supernatural beings, whose authority derives from demonstrated connection to powers that control rainfall and harvest. Across the central highlands, where Tlatilco emerges as a thriving settlement, potters shape clay vessels whose forms mirror prototypes created in wetland sites they have never seen. Their kilns burn with temperatures achieved through firing methods learned from traveling specialists who carry knowledge across vast distances like seeds scattered by wind. The baby-face figurines that emerge from these workshops display the characteristic features of Gulf Coast supernatural beings: puffy cheeks that suggest divine breath, downturned mouths that speak of otherworldly wisdom, eyes that seem to gaze into realms beyond mortal vision. Pacific Coast cacao cultivators in Soconusco territory exchange their precious beans, currency more valuable than gold in some markets, for ceremonial axes carved from jade that originated in Guatemala, yet was shaped by artisans trained in Venta workshops. The chocolate they produce from fermented cacao becomes the drink of gods and kings, its bitter complexity transforming simple consumption into communion with supernatural forces. Trade routes that carry these sacred beverages inland create dependencies that bind diverse populations to Gulf Coast authority through their desire for divine intoxication. At Xochicalco, where future urban planners will create one of Mesoamerica's most sophisticated cities, early architects already orient their platforms toward cardinal directions with precision that reveals astronomical training received from Venta priest astronomers. The drainage systems they install channel water through stone-lined channels that replicate hydraulic principles developed in wetland environments, yet prove equally effective in mountain contexts. Their buildings rise according to cosmic alignments that unite earthly construction with celestial movements. Zapotec rulers, emerging in the valley of Oaxaca, dispatch embassies to La Venta, bearing gifts that acknowledge cultural superiority while asserting territorial independence. The hieroglyphic writing system they develop adapts symbolic elements pioneered in Gulf Coast workshops, transforming pictographic communication into bureaucratic tools that enable administration of territories their ancestors could never have governed. Their scribes learn to record not merely objects and actions, but abstract concepts like time and number that require intellectual frameworks borrowed from lowland calendar keepers. Monte Alban's hilltop location provides defensive advantages unavailable to lowland sites, yet its architectural program reveals profound influence from ceremonial complexes whose builders understood principles of cosmic alignment and monumental construction. The ball courts they construct replicate acoustic properties discovered in Gulf Coast venues, where rubber spheres create sounds that enhance spiritual significance of athletic competition. Their tomb paintings blend indigenous artistic traditions with iconographic elements that encode were-jaguar theology in visual forms adapted to mountain mythology. Maya settlements throughout the Petén lowlands and Chiapas highlands witness the arrival of sculptors whose techniques for working volcanic stone reveal training received in La Venta workshops. The stelae they erect display costume elements and ceremonial regalia that mirror Gulf Coast prototypes, yet their calendar inscriptions reveal mathematical innovations that will eventually surpass anything achieved by their teachers. They learn to carve numbers and dates with precision that enables coordination of ceremonies across vast distances while maintaining astronomical accuracy that rivals modern calculations. Izapa becomes a crucial cultural bridge between coastal and mountain zones, its monuments displaying iconographic programs that translate were-jaguar concepts into mythological systems comprehensible to highland populations. The Tree of Life imagery that appears on their stelae adapts cosmic symbolism developed in wetland sites to mountain religious traditions that emphasize vertical connections between underworld, earth surface, and sky realms. Their sculptors master techniques that enable them to carve complex narratives in stone, creating visual libraries that preserve theological knowledge for generations who cannot read written texts. Obsidian merchants traveling from volcanic sources near future Teotihuacan learn quality control methods developed in La Venta workshops, where master craftsmen understand how to select raw materials and knapping techniques that produce edges sharper than surgical instruments. They return to their mountain quarries, carrying knowledge that transforms local production capabilities, while establishing commercial relationships that channel their finest products toward Gulf Coast ceremonial complexes. The blades they create enable bloodletting rituals that demonstrate royal willingness to sacrifice for collective welfare, while asserting exclusive access to supernatural communication. Ceramic traditions spread from Gulf Coast kilns to workshops throughout Mesoamerica, as traveling potters teach firing techniques that require precise temperature control and clay preparation methods developed through generations of experimentation. The white-rimmed black pottery that becomes popular during this period displays technical mastery that elevates utilitarian vessels into artistic achievements worthy of elite patronage. Local potters who master these methods gain status that connects their communities to broader cultural networks, while enabling them to produce goods that command premium prices in regional markets. Magnetite mirrors, polished to perfection in La Venta workshops, appear in elite burials from Guerrero to Honduras, their surfaces reflecting more than physical appearances. These spiritual instruments enable communication with supernatural realms where ancestors dwell and gods observe mortal actions, their creation requiring knowledge of mineral properties and grinding techniques that produce results rivaling modern optical equipment. The mirrors serve as windows into otherworldly domains, their possession marking their owners as individuals whose authority transcends ordinary political power. Serpentine ornaments originating in quarries controlled by Gulf Coast authorities become prestige items throughout territories that lack access to this distinctive green metamorphic stone. The carving techniques required to work serpentine into complex forms spread through master-apprentice relationships that create informal hierarchies, linking provincial workshops to metropolitan centers. Artisans who learn these methods establish their own training schools, disseminating knowledge that enables local production of goods inspired by Gulf Coast prototypes, while maintaining quality standards that satisfy elite consumers. Rubber processing knowledge spreads from tropical forests, where latex-producing trees grow naturally, to highland regions, where different species require adapted extraction and preparation methods. The elastic balls created from processed tree sap carry theological significance that transforms athletic competition into cosmic drama, their bouncing movements reenacting mythological conflicts between supernatural forces. Games played with these spheres attract participants from territories that might otherwise resist direct cultural influence, spreading Jaguar mythology through sporting events that unite diverse populations around shared religious experiences. Bloodletting implements crafted from Gulf Coast obsidian appear in elite burial contexts throughout Mesoamerica, their standardized forms revealing shared ritual practices that unite regional ruling classes around common religious observances. The precision required to create these ceremonial tools, edges capable of piercing flesh without shattering, handles designed for ritual manipulation, forms that encode spiritual symbolism, demonstrates technical mastery that confirms lowland superiority in crucial areas of sacred technology. Their distribution creates networks of religious obligation that transcend political boundaries while reinforcing hierarchical social organization. Copal incense burned in ceremonies from Guatemala to central Mexico originates primarily in tree species that grow in Gulf Coast territories, creating commercial dependencies that ensure continued economic relationships while spreading aromatic traditions throughout Mesoamerican religious practices. The preparation methods that transform raw tree resins into substances suitable for sacred purposes require specialized knowledge that travels with merchant networks, creating informal educational systems that disseminate theological concepts alongside commercial goods. Shell ornaments flowing inland from coastal collection areas receive artistic enhancement in Gulf Coast workshops that increases their spiritual significance while demonstrating the transformative power of lowland craftsmanship. Pacific spondylus shells and Atlantic strombus specimens both acquire value-added processing that creates prestige items sought by elite consumers throughout the continental interior. These modified shells become symbols of participation in broader cultural networks, while serving as vehicles for spreading artistic techniques and aesthetic standards. Feathered serpent imagery that originates in Gulf Coast theological systems appears in artistic contexts throughout Mesoamerica, as indigenous traditions adapt this powerful symbol to serve regional religious needs. The iconographic programs that develop around this imagery create shared symbolic languages that enable communication across cultural and linguistic boundaries, while preserving essential theological concepts that support hierarchical social organization. Local artists learn to carve, paint, and sculpt these complex symbols while adapting them to serve their own spiritual requirements. Precious metals flow toward Gulf Coast treasuries from sources throughout Mesoamerica, demonstrating the continent-spanning scope of tribute networks that channel wealth towards ceremonial complexes where divine kings display their supernatural favor through material accumulation. Gold dust from stream deposits, silver from mountain veins, copper from specialized sources. Each metal type requires extraction, refinement, and working techniques that lowland specialists master, while selectively sharing knowledge with allied populations who provide raw materials in exchange for finished goods. The Cascajal block, carved with symbols that may represent the earliest writing system in the Americas, demonstrates intellectual innovations that will influence literacy development throughout Mesoamerica, even as specific scripts evolve to serve different linguistic and cultural requirements. Whether these markings constitute true writing or preliminary steps towards systematic notation, their existence proves conceptual development that anticipates achievements. Future civilizations will elaborate into fully functional recording systems. Sacred geography emerges from Gulf Coast religious practices and spreads throughout Mesoamerica as local populations adapt pilgrimage traditions and shrine veneration to regional landscapes while maintaining theological frameworks that connect earthly locations to cosmic forces. Cave sites, mountain peaks, and water sources acquire spiritual significance that mirrors lowland models, while serving indigenous religious needs that ensure cultural continuity during periods of political change. Master metallurgists travel with merchant caravans to distant regions, where they demonstrate techniques for achieving higher smelting temperatures and creating alloys that surpass anything produced through purely local methods. In Oaxacan valleys, where copper deposits await exploitation, these specialists show indigenous craftsmen how to construct kilns that burn hot enough to work metals that regional smiths had previously found impossible to manipulate. They establish workshops that produce tools and ornaments whose quality rivals metropolitan standards, while training local artisans who carry knowledge to even more distant territories. Young astronomers from emerging Maya centers journey to Venta, where they observe calendar calculations that enable prediction of eclipses and planetary movements with accuracy that transforms their understanding of cosmic cycles. The priests who teach them guard the most advanced mathematical concepts, while sharing enough knowledge to ensure that regional sites can coordinate their ceremonies with celestial events. These students return home carrying wooden tablets inscribed with numerical systems that become foundations for astronomical achievements that will eventually surpass their teachers' accomplishments. Gulf Coast administrators, who oversee tribute collection from highland territories, teach regional officials how to organize population counts and coordinate resource extraction across mountainous landscapes that present logistical challenges unknown in lowland environments. The record-keeping techniques they demonstrate use knotted cords and carved tallies that enable accurate tracking of goods and labor obligations across distances that would overwhelm purely oral administrative methods. Local leaders who master these systems modify them to serve their own governmental needs, while maintaining communication with lowland centers that expect regular reports on territorial conditions. When disputes arise between merchants from different regions operating in Gulf Coast markets, judges trained in lowland legal traditions resolve conflicts using precedents that blend various regional customs with imperial requirements for maintaining commercial peace. Legal decisions create precedents that influence dispute resolution throughout expanding trade networks, while establishing jurisprudential frameworks that enable peaceful interaction between populations following different cultural traditions. Marriage contracts, property rights, and commercial regulations all show influence from Gulf Coast models, while accommodating local inheritance customs and social obligations. Lowland priests serving at Venta incorporate deities from allied territories into ceremonial observances that validate political relationships, while demonstrating theological flexibility that enables peaceful governance of diverse populations. When Highland delegations arrive carrying images of mountain gods unknown in coastal traditions, ceremony masters develop ritual frameworks that accommodate these supernatural entities while maintaining Wajaguar supremacy. The resulting hybrid worship satisfies all participants while establishing precedents that regional authorities adapt to their own multi-ethnic territories. Zapotec nobles who witness Gulf Coast rituals during diplomatic visits return to Monte Alban carrying jade bloodletters and obsidian lancets that enable their own priests to perform ceremonies previously impossible with indigenous materials. The shamans who demonstrate these techniques insist that proper communication with supernatural forces requires tools prepared according to specific methods that only coastal specialists fully understand. Yet Highland priests who learn these rituals gradually adapt them to serve regional deities while maintaining theological frameworks that validate their ruler's authority through supernatural sanction. The question of whether Gulf Coast civilization created intellectual foundations for later Mesoamerican achievements, or merely participated in broader patterns of parallel development, becomes evident at sites like Chalcatzingo, where local artists carve reliefs that combine lowland iconography with regional mythological traditions. The jaguar-masked figures they create in mountain caves demonstrate theological concepts that show such detailed correspondence with coastal prototypes that direct cultural transmission appears undeniable. Yet they serve local spiritual needs that transform borrowed elements into indigenous expressions of divine authority. Settlement patterns that develop around Gulf Coast urban planning principles influence city construction throughout Mesoamerica, as emerging centers adapt architectural innovations to local materials and environmental conditions while maintaining essential features that demonstrate cultural sophistication. Plaza arrangements, pyramid orientations, and residential organization reflect lowland precedents, even when specific building techniques must accommodate different geological and climatic contexts. The resulting hybrid architectural traditions create distinctive regional styles that preserve essential elements while serving local functional requirements. Artistic exchange flowing through Gulf Coast-centered networks creates hybrid traditions that combine features from different regional styles, while establishing aesthetic standards that influence cultural development across continental distances. Textile patterns, sculptural techniques, architectural decorations, and ceremonial regalia all show cross-cultural influences that result from lowland facilitation of inter-regional communication. Local artists learn new methods while teaching their own innovations, creating synthesis that enriches all participating traditions. By 400 BC, Gulf Coast influence reaches its maximum geographic extent as trading networks link the lowlands to territories spanning from Honduras to central Mexico, creating the first continental-scale cultural integration in American history. Yet this very success creates conditions that will challenge lowland political control, as regional populations develop capabilities that enable them to compete with, rather than merely emulate their former teachers. The stage is set for transformations that will reshape Mesoamerican civilization in directions that coastal rulers cannot predict or control, as the students prepare to surpass their masters in achievements that will define the next chapter of American cultural development. Around 400 BC, the last priest-king walks through corridors that echo with the footsteps of generations, his jade ornaments catching torchlight that flickers across walls carved with symbols whose meanings grow more distant with each passing season. Outside, the Great Pyramid still dominates the wetland horizon, its massive earthen slopes bearing witness to achievements that once commanded respect from the Pacific coast to the Valley of Mexico. Yet something fundamental has shifted in the cosmos that sustained this civilization for over a millennium. The tribute canoes that once arrived in steady procession now come sporadically, carrying messages of defiance rather than submission. At the quarries where workers once extracted basalt for colossal monuments, master stonecutters lay down their tools and abandon half-finished sculptures whose blank faces will never receive the features of divine kings. The hammers that rang against stone chisels fall silent as craftsmen gather their families and depart for distant centers where new forms of authority promise greater rewards. Tool marks on unfinished heads reveal the precise moment when carvers walked away from commissions that would never be completed. In workshops scattered throughout the sacred complex, jade workers who once produced masterpieces for royal regalia pack their most precious tools and seek employment in Maya sites where mathematical innovations and astronomical wisdom surpass anything achieved in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Their departure leaves behind partially carved masks and unfinished ornaments whose green surfaces will never achieve the mirror polish that transformed earthly materials into divine regalia. Farmers who once maintained elaborate terraced fields begin abandoning agricultural plots that no longer produce the yields their ancestors had enjoyed. Soil that had sustained intensive cultivation for centuries shows signs of exhaustion that even the most experienced agriculturalists cannot remedy through traditional techniques. The complex irrigation systems that channeled water through sacred precincts require maintenance that becomes impossible to coordinate, as specialized expertise disperses among communities who question whether such elaborate engineering serves their immediate needs. The Coatzacoalcos River changes course during a particularly violent flood season, abandoning channels that had been carefully managed for generations and carving new paths that bypass the hydraulic systems supporting urban concentrations. Engineers who once maintained sophisticated drainage networks find themselves powerless against natural forces that exceed their technological capabilities. Water that once flowed obediently through stone-lined channels now spreads across agricultural fields, leaving salt deposits that poison crops and force populations to seek new territories. Young Maya nobles from highland Chiapas arrive as visitors to ceremonies that grow smaller and less impressive with each seasonal celebration. They observe architectural techniques and ceremonial practices that their own craftsmen have already surpassed through innovations in mathematics and astronomy. When they return to their homeland, they carry detailed knowledge of Olmec methods, while dismissing the civilization that created them as relics of a bygone age whose time has passed. At Monte Alban, Zapotec rulers establish fortifications on hilltops that provide defensive advantages unavailable to lowland sites. Their merchants venture into territories that once acknowledged only Olmec dominance, offering highland products directly to consumers who no longer require Gulf Coast intermediaries. The tribute systems that had channeled exotic goods towards sacred sites collapse as regional leaders assert control over local resources while refusing to acknowledge external claims to political supremacy. In the Valley of Mexico, the settlement that will become Teotihuacan attracts populations from across Mesoamerica through urban planning innovations that dwarf anything attempted by previous civilizations. Refugee craftsmen from abandoned Olmec centers bring their expertise to construction projects, whose scale makes even the most ambitious Gulf Coast monuments appear provincial by comparison. The planned city that emerges from this growth demonstrates organizational capabilities that render traditional forms of authority obsolete. Villages throughout the Olmec Heartland witness confrontations between local leaders and representatives from sacred complexes who arrive demanding tribute from groups increasingly unwilling to support distant rulers. Arguments that once ended with grudging compliance now escalate into violence as communities assert their right to retain resources for their own use. Sacred symbols that once commanded automatic respect become targets for deliberate destruction, as people express their rejection of ideologies they now view as oppressive. Colossal heads that had proclaimed eternal royal authority suffer systematic defacement that targets their symbolic significance rather than simply destroying them as obstacles to new construction. Villagers armed with stone hammers climb scaffolding to reach the carved features of divine kings, methodically obliterating noses, lips, and eyes, until royal portraits become unrecognizable abstractions. The careful selection of which features to destroy reveals organized rejection of the theological concepts that had sustained Olmec civilization. Sacred caches that once received precious offerings from across Mesoamerica lie abandoned as pilgrims cease their journeys to shrines whose priests can no longer guarantee divine favor. Jade axes that had been buried with elaborate ritual preparation remain undisturbed in underground chambers, where no one comes to renew the ceremonies that once maintained cosmic balance. The sacred geography that had attracted devotees from distant regions loses its spiritual significance, as local communities develop alternative practices that address their immediate needs. Priests who once maintained complex astronomical observations abandon their posts, as the wisdom they preserve becomes irrelevant to communities facing more immediate challenges of survival and reorganization. Calendar stones that had enabled precise prediction of seasonal cycles crack under exposure to weather, as no one maintains the shelters that had protected them for generations. The intellectual achievements that had distinguished Olmec civilization from its neighbors survive only in fragmentary form among scattered specialists who carry their expertise to new centers. Merchants who had operated extensive networks connecting Gulf Coast hubs to distant markets redirect their activities toward emerging commercial sites that offer more favorable terms to producers and consumers. Canoe fleets that once carried tribute toward Venta now transport goods between regional centers that acknowledge no external authority. Trade languages that had facilitated transactions across vast territories fragment into local dialects as the political systems that had supported them disappear. Skilled administrators who once coordinated complex tribute collection and resource distribution seek employment in Maya and Zapotec cities, where their organizational abilities contribute to governmental innovations that surpass anything achieved by their former employers. Their departure leaves sacred sites without the institutional expertise necessary to maintain even basic functions, hastening the collapse of systems that had required sophisticated coordination to operate effectively. Royal residences that had housed generations of divine kings stand empty as their last occupants flee to distant relatives or attempt to establish new power bases in regions beyond the reach of popular uprisings. Palace courtyards where ambassadors once presented tribute from across Mesoamerica become overgrown with vegetation, as no one maintains the elaborate gardens that had demonstrated royal control over nature itself. Throne rooms carved from living rock echo only with the sounds of wind and dripping water. Children who had been trained from birth to serve in ritual capacities abandon their education to pursue occupations that offer better prospects in the transformed political landscape. Young sculptors who might have carved the next generation of colossal monuments become farmers or traders instead, taking their partially developed skills to communities that value practical abilities over artistic achievement. The cultural reproduction systems that had sustained Olmec civilization for centuries fail as each generation finds fewer reasons to perpetuate traditions their parents had considered sacred. Jade workshops where master craftsmen had created regalia for divine kings stand abandoned, their floors littered with unfinished ornaments and broken tools. Apprentices who once learned techniques that required decades to master scatter, to pursue opportunities in emerging centers, where different forms of artistic expression command greater respect and better compensation. The technological expertise that had enabled achievements rivaling anything produced in the ancient world disperses among groups who adapt these skills to serve new cultural priorities. Ball courts that once hosted games combining athletic competition with cosmic drama fall silent as the theological concepts that had given these contests meaning lose their persuasive power. Playing surfaces carefully constructed to produce specific acoustic effects crack under neglect as no one performs the maintenance that had preserved them for generations. Rubber balls that had bounced with apparent supernatural energy decay in storage chambers that no one visits. Sacred caves where shamans had communed with supernatural forces become refuges for displaced communities rather than sites of religious observance. Underground chambers that once housed elaborate rituals now shelter families whose villages have been abandoned due to environmental degradation or political violence. The spiritual practices that had distinguished elite specialists become democratized as ordinary people adapt ceremonial techniques for their own purposes. Feathered serpent imagery that had symbolized the union of earthly and celestial powers appears in new contexts where it loses its connection to centralized political authority. Village artisans incorporate these motifs into local decorative traditions that serve community rather than royal purposes. The iconographic programs that had encoded complex theological concepts fragment into decorative elements whose original meanings become increasingly obscure. Jaguar masks that had enabled shamanic transformation gather dust in storage chambers that no one enters, as the rituals they served lose their relevance to communities facing immediate challenges of survival and reorganization. Sacred implements carved from jade and obsidian remain unused as the understanding required to employ them properly disappears with the specialists who had maintained these traditions. Astronomical observation platforms that had enabled precise calendar calculations stand empty as the priests who operated them flee or die without training successors. Stone circles carefully aligned with celestial movements lose their significance as the ceremonies they supported cease to occur. The mathematical wisdom that had enabled accurate prediction of seasonal changes survives only among scattered individuals who carry fragments of this learning to new sites. By 300 BC, jungle vines climb the sides of pyramids that once attracted pilgrims from across Mesoamerica. Cecropia trees take root in plaza joints where thousands had once gathered for seasonal celebrations. Howler monkeys nest in palace chambers where divine kings had received tribute from distant territories. The colossal heads that proclaimed eternal authority gaze upon landscapes where jaguars hunt and parrots nest, their carved features slowly weathering under tropical rains that no one diverts. Occasional travelers still visit these abandoned sites, drawn by memories of their former significance and hopes that ancient powers might respond to proper supplication. They find monuments whose scale continues to inspire awe, but whose political significance has vanished completely. The pilgrims who make these journeys carry away stories of vanished glory that will inspire later civilizations while serving as warnings about the impermanence of human achievement. Former Olmec territories witness the establishment of new settlements, organized around different principles of social organization and resource management. Village councils that emphasize consensus decision-making replace hierarchical systems that had concentrated power in royal courts. Leaders chosen for their demonstrated competence in specific tasks govern through persuasion rather than divine mandate. creating political structures that prove more responsive to community needs. Maya scribes working in highland settlements adapt writing symbols that had begun developing during the height of Olmec power, transforming them into fully developed systems of record-keeping that surpass anything achieved in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Mathematical concepts that had enabled precise calendar calculations find new expression in astronomical systems that demonstrate intellectual achievements far beyond their origins. The cultural DNA that had enabled Olmec innovations spreads throughout Mesoamerica, influencing developments that exceed anything their creators had imagined possible. At Teotihuacan, urban planners implement designs that accommodate inhabitants larger than any previous Mesoamerican settlement had supported, while avoiding the environmental problems that had contributed to Olmec decline. Engineers develop water management systems that serve dense urban concentrations without degrading local ecosystems. The lessons learned from Olmec failures inform innovations that enable sustainable urban development on unprecedented scales. Zapotec rulers at Monte Alban establish administrative systems that learn from Olmec precedents while avoiding their apparent weaknesses. Tribute collection operates through negotiated agreements rather than divine mandate, creating political relationships that prove more durable during periods of stress. Military fortifications protect cities against the popular uprisings that had destroyed Gulf Coast rule, while diplomatic networks maintain peaceful relationships with neighboring powers. The transformation is complete when the last keeper of Olmec calendar learning dies in a Maya settlement, where he had spent his final years teaching mathematical concepts to scribes who surpass his achievements before his funeral observances conclude. His students adapt the astronomical learning he preserved, combining it with their own innovations to create systems of timekeeping that will influence Mesoamerican development for centuries. The civilization that had created the first writing symbols in the Americas becomes the foundation upon which successor societies build intellectual achievements that dwarf anything their predecessors had imagined. In the end, Olmec civilization disappears not through external conquest or natural catastrophe, but through transformation into something larger than itself. The colossal heads that once stood as symbols of timeless power now sit in silence, their meaning left for future generations to wonder about. The artificial mountains built from millions of basketloads of earth stand as monuments to human ambition, while serving as foundations for the trees and animals that reclaim these landscapes. The legacy of the people who created Mesoamerica's first urban centers endures in the innovations that made their successors possible, ensuring that their influence survives long after their political authority has vanished into the green depths of tropical forests. In the highland valleys of Oaxaca, Zapotec scribes working 3 centuries after Venta's abandonment still carve symbols whose forms echo the sacred writing that once graced Gulf Coast monuments. Their hieroglyphs flow across stone surfaces, with confidence born from traditions that stretch back to wetland, ceremonial centers where the first American writing system took shape. The mathematical concepts they employ to calculate calendar dates incorporate temporal frameworks learned from lowland priest astronomers. Yet their achievements in astronomical calculation surpass anything their teachers accomplished. Monte Alban rises according to cosmic alignments that mirror principles established beside tropical rivers, its hilltop location providing defensive advantages while maintaining the sacred geography that connects earthly construction to celestial movements. Deep in the Petenge rainforests, Maya architects raised pyramids whose orientations preserve astronomical knowledge, transmitted through generations of cultural exchange that began when Gulf Coast merchants first carried jade and obsidian along jungle rivers. The long count calendar that enables their scribes to record dates spanning millions of years builds upon mathematical foundations established in lowland contexts. Yet it extends these concepts to encompass cosmic cycles that dwarf anything previously imagined. At Tikal and Palenque, where towering temples pierce the forest canopy, like stone prayers reaching toward heaven, the acoustic properties of ceremonial plazas replicate sound effects discovered in wetland ball courts, where rubber spheres once bounced with supernatural elasticity. Teotihuacan emerges from central Mexican highlands as the largest urban center in ancient America, its grid-patterned streets and monumental architecture demonstrating urban planning principles that trace directly to innovations pioneered in Gulf Coast sites. The Avenue of the Dead follows orientations that mirror spatial concepts first developed in Venta's ceremonial complex, while the massive pyramids that dominate the cityscape employ construction techniques adapted from earthwork methods that transform tropical swamps into artificial mountains. Merchants who operate from this metropolitan hub carry goods along trade routes that follow paths established by lowland predecessors, their networks connecting territories from Guatemala to northern Mexico through commercial relationships that preserve geographic knowledge accumulated across centuries. At Xochicalco, where sculptors create some of Mesoamerica's most sophisticated reliefs, the iconographic programs reveal synthesis of artistic traditions that blend highland innovations with theological concepts inherited from wetland sources. The feathered serpent imagery that decorates temple facades speaks a visual language whose grammar was established beside Gulf Coast rivers, yet it serves regional spiritual needs while maintaining connections to cosmic principles that justify earthly authority through celestial mandate. The ball court that echoes with sounds of cosmic drama employs acoustic engineering that replicates discoveries made in lowland venues, where athletic competition first merged with religious ceremony. Maya scribes working at Copan and Quirigua record historical events using calendar systems that coordinate solar observations with lunar cycles according to mathematical frameworks inherited from Gulf Coast priest astronomers. Their stelae proclaim royal achievements while encoding astronomical knowledge that enables prediction of eclipses and planetary movements with accuracy, that demonstrates intellectual sophistication rivaling any civilization of antiquity. The bloodletting ceremonies that validate royal communion with supernatural forces employ jade implements and obsidian lancets whose forms preserve standardized traditions that unite diverse populations around common religious experiences. Zapotec goldsmiths working in Oaxacan valleys create ornaments whose iconographic programs encode Jaguar theology in precious metal forms that preserve theological concepts across spans of time that separate them from their Gulf Coast origins by half a millennium. The techniques they employ to work gold and silver into complex three-dimensional forms build upon metallurgical knowledge transmitted through networks of cultural exchange. Yet their artistic achievements surpass anything accomplished by earlier civilizations. Their workshops train apprentices who carry expertise to even more distant territories, spreading technical knowledge while adapting artistic traditions to serve regional preferences and available materials. In highland Guatemala, jade workers, whose ancestors learned carving techniques from Gulf Coast masters, continue to transform greenstone into objects whose spiritual significance transcends their material value. The drilling methods that create perfectly round holes through mineral harder than steel. The polishing techniques that achieve mirror-like surfaces. The iconographic skills that render complex theological concepts in translucent stone. These achievements preserve accumulated knowledge while serving spiritual needs that ensure cultural continuity across political transformations. Their masks enable highland rulers to assume supernatural identities that connect them to cosmic forces. their authority deriving from demonstrated access to divine powers rather than mere earthly achievement. Across the Maya lowlands, architects working at dozens of ceremonial centers employ construction principles inherited from wetland predecessors while adapting them to serve local environmental conditions and cultural requirements. The corbelled arches that span interior spaces, the steep-sided pyramids that maximize height while minimizing ground coverage, the plaza arrangements that accommodate large gatherings while maintaining acoustic properties. These architectural innovations preserve essential concepts while enabling creative responses to different contexts and needs. At Izapa, where sculptors create visual narratives that preserve theological knowledge for populations who cannot read written texts, the iconographic programs demonstrate sophisticated synthesis of Gulf Coast symbolism with Highland mythology. The tree of life imagery that dominates their stele adapts cosmic concepts developed in wetland sites to mountain religious traditions, while maintaining theological frameworks that connect earthly locations to supernatural forces. Their monuments become libraries carved in stone, preserving wisdom that bridges cultural and linguistic boundaries, while enabling transmission of essential knowledge across generations. Pacific coast settlements from Chiapas to El Salvador witness the establishment of ball courts, whose construction replicates acoustic properties discovered in Gulf Coast venues. Their sloped walls and playing surfaces designed to amplify sounds that enhance spiritual significance of athletic competition. The rubber balls that bounce with supernatural elasticity carry theological meanings that transform sport into cosmic drama, their movements reenacting mythological conflicts between fundamental forces while providing venues for political negotiation and social integration. Highland settlements throughout central Mexico develop ceramic traditions that employ firing techniques inherited from Gulf Coast potters, their vessels displaying artistic sophistication that elevates utilitarian objects into achievements worthy of elite patronage. The white-rimmed black pottery that becomes popular across vast territories demonstrates technical mastery that requires precise temperature control and clay preparation methods transmitted through master-apprentice relationships. Local potters who master these approaches gain status that connects their communities to broader cultural networks, while enabling production of goods that command premium prices in regional markets. Merchants operating from Cholula and other highland centers follow trade routes that preserve geographic knowledge accumulated by Gulf Coast predecessors. Their caravans carrying jade from Guatemala, obsidian from volcanic sources, and cacao from tropical lowlands through commercial networks that span continental distances. The standardized weights and measures they employ, the diplomatic protocols that govern interactions between different populations, the credit systems that enable complex transactions across cultural boundaries. These innovations build upon precedents established by lowland merchants whose expertise enabled the first continental-scale exchange networks in American history. Zapotec engineers working on Monte Alban's construction adapt hydraulic principles developed in wetland environments to create water management systems that serve dense urban populations while preventing the environmental degradation that contributed to Gulf Coast decline. Their terracing techniques enable intensive cultivation of steep slopes while preventing soil erosion. Their reservoirs store water during abundant seasons while providing security during droughts. The lessons learned from lowland experience inform innovations that enable sustainable urban development on scales that surpass anything previously attempted. Maya astronomers working at Palenque and other centers develop mathematical concepts that build upon numerical systems inherited from Gulf Coast priest astronomers, while extending these frameworks to achieve calculations of unprecedented complexity. Their predictions of eclipses and planetary movements demonstrate intellectual achievements that serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. Their accuracy enabling coordination of religious activities across vast territories, while validating royal claims to supernatural sanction. The Venus tables they create preserve astronomical knowledge in forms that enable transmission across generations of calendar keepers. At Cacaxtla, where murals display some of Mesoamerica's most sophisticated painted narratives, the artistic programs reveal synthesis of traditions that blend Maya innovations with concepts inherited from Gulf Coast sources. The were-jaguar imagery that appears in highland contexts preserves theological elements established in wetland ceremonial centers, while serving regional spiritual needs that ensure cultural continuity during periods of political change. The feathered serpent motifs that decorate temple walls speak visual languages whose vocabulary was established beside tropical rivers, yet adapted to serve highland mythology. Mixtec scribes working in Oaxacan centers record historical events using pictographic systems that preserve symbolic elements inherited from earlier writing traditions while adapting them to serve regional linguistic requirements. Their codices preserve genealogical information that validates royal authority while demonstrating artistic achievements that transform record-keeping into aesthetic excellence. The marriage alliances they document create kinship networks that span vast territories. Their political relationships maintained through exchanges of prestige goods whose forms preserve artistic traditions, established in Gulf Coast workshops. Highland settlements throughout the Valley of Mexico witness the establishment of educational institutions that train administrators, priests and artisans using knowledge systems that preserve intellectual frameworks inherited from lowland sources, while adapting them to serve regional needs. The schools that emerge from these foundations teach mathematical concepts, astronomical observation, and artistic techniques that enable cultural development while maintaining connections to ancient precedents. Their graduates carry expertise to distant territories, where they establish similar institutions that preserve and transmit accumulated wisdom. Tarascan metalworkers operating from highland Michoacan employ techniques that build upon foundational knowledge transmitted through networks established by Gulf Coast merchants. Their achievements in copper and bronze working enabling production of tools and ornaments whose quality surpasses anything previously accomplished in Mesoamerica. The alloy compositions they develop, the casting methods they employ, the surface treatments they achieve. These innovations preserve essential principles while enabling creative responses to regional preferences and available materials. Maya architects working at Chichen Itza create structures whose astronomical alignments preserve knowledge inherited from Gulf Coast priest astronomers, while serving ceremonial needs that unite diverse populations around shared religious experiences. The pyramid that marks equinoxes through shadow effects demonstrates understanding of solar movements that enables coordination of agricultural activities with cosmic rhythms, its construction preserving mathematical concepts while adapting them to serve regional spiritual requirements. In highland Guatemala, Quiche Maya rulers maintain court ceremonies that employ jade bloodletters and obsidian lancets whose forms preserve standardized traditions inherited from wetland sources. Their rituals demonstrating royal communion with supernatural forces while asserting exclusive access to divine powers. The theological frameworks that justify their authority trace to concepts established in Gulf Coast ceremonial centers. Yet they serve regional needs while maintaining essential elements that connect earthly governance to cosmic order. Aztec merchants operating from Tenochtitlan follow trade routes that preserve geographic knowledge accumulated by Gulf Coast predecessors. Their expeditions carrying goods across territories that span from Honduras to northern Mexico, through commercial relationships that demonstrate continental-scale organization. The tribute systems they establish, the diplomatic protocols they employ, the market regulations they enforce. These innovations build upon precedents established by lowland rulers, while adapting them to serve imperial needs that surpass anything previously attempted. Throughout the Valley of Oaxaca, Zapotec communities maintain agricultural practices that employ techniques inherited from Gulf Coast farmers, while adapting them to highland environmental conditions. Their terracing methods prevent soil erosion, while maximizing cultivation of steep slopes. Their water management systems control both drought and flooding through engineering knowledge that preserves essential principles while serving regional needs. The crop varieties they cultivate include species whose development required botanical knowledge transmitted through generations of cultural exchange. Maya scribes working at Copan record mathematical concepts using numerical systems that build upon frameworks inherited from Gulf Coast calendar keepers. Their achievements in astronomical calculation, enabling coordination of ceremonial activities across vast territories, while demonstrating intellectual sophistication that serves both practical and spiritual purposes. The accuracy of their eclipse predictions validates royal claims to supernatural knowledge, while enabling communities to prepare for celestial events that affect agricultural planning and religious observance. At Mitla, where Zapotec architects create some of Mesoamerica's most sophisticated geometric decorations, the artistic programs preserve aesthetic principles established in Gulf Coast contexts, while adapting them to serve regional preferences and available materials. The mosaic patterns that adorn temple facades employ mathematical concepts that enable precise calculation of proportions, while creating visual effects that enhance spiritual experiences. Their workshops train artisans who carry expertise to distant territories, while maintaining quality standards that preserve ancient precedents. Highland settlements throughout central Mexico develop legal systems that employ judicial principles inherited from Gulf Coast precedents, while adapting them to serve regional social organization and cultural practices. The synthesis of local customs with imperial requirements creates hybrid frameworks that enable peaceful governance of diverse populations, while maintaining essential concepts of justice and social order. The marriage laws, property rights, and commercial regulations they establish preserve solutions to problems that first arose when lowland rulers learned to manage complex territories. Maya communities throughout the Petén maintain religious practices that employ theological concepts inherited from Gulf Coast sources, while adapting them to serve regional spiritual needs and available resources. The bloodletting ceremonies that demonstrate royal communion with supernatural forces, the ball game rituals that reenact cosmic conflicts, the pilgrimage traditions that connect earthly locations to divine powers. These observances preserve essential elements while enabling creative responses to changing circumstances. The transformation proves so complete that later generations lose direct memory of the civilization that established foundations for everything they achieve. Yet the influence endures in the mathematical concepts that enable astronomical calculations, the agricultural techniques that feed growing populations, the artistic traditions that inspire creative expression, the urban planning principles that organize complex settlements. The colossal heads that gaze eternally eastward become mysterious relics whose meaning escapes those who inherit the landscapes they once dominated. Yet the ideas they represented continue to shape human possibilities across territories that span from sea to sea. What began as innovations developed beside tropical rivers becomes the foundation for achievements that define Mesoamerican civilization for millennia. The were-jaguar theology that justified royal authority through supernatural sanction evolves into complex pantheons that serve regional needs while preserving essential concepts. the calendar systems that coordinated earthly activities with cosmic rhythms, enable intellectual achievements that surpass anything their creators imagined. The trade networks that connected distant territories create commercial relationships that persist across political transformations, while preserving geographic knowledge accumulated through generations of exploration. The urban planning that enabled dense populations becomes the foundation for cities whose scale and sophistication demonstrate human capabilities that transform wilderness into centers of learning, commerce, and artistic achievement. The monumental architecture that proclaimed divine favor inspires structures whose beauty and engineering excellence celebrate the marriage of human ambition with supernatural guidance. The artistic traditions that encoded theological wisdom in visual forms create aesthetic standards that influence creative expression across spans of time and cultural change that separate later achievements from their sources by centuries, yet preserve essential elements that define excellence. The story of America's first civilization thus becomes more than the tale of a particular people who created remarkable achievements in tropical lowlands during the final centuries of the second millennium before Christ. It demonstrates the power of human creativity to establish foundations that support achievements far beyond anything their creators could foresee. The capacity of ideas to transcend the political structures that first gave them form. The ability of accumulated wisdom to survive transformations that destroy the institutions where knowledge first developed. The influence spreads like seeds scattered by wind, taking root in soils far from their origins, yet preserving essential characteristics that enable recognition across vast distances of space and time. The mathematical concepts that coordinate human activities with cosmic rhythms, the artistic principles that transform raw materials into vehicles for complex meanings, the social innovations that enable cooperation among diverse populations. These achievements represent humanity's capacity to create meaning from experience while building tomorrow from the accumulated wisdom of yesterday. The colossal heads that stand silent, witness to vanished grandeur, proclaim truths that transcend the particular circumstances of their creation. They speak of human potential that recognizes no boundaries, of creativity that transforms limitations into opportunities, of vision that sees possibility where others perceive only obstacles. Their eternal gaze reminds all who encounter them that greatness belongs not to single cultures or continents, but to the species that dares to carve meaning from stone, to build cities from swamps, to transform individual dreams into collective achievements that outlast the civilizations that created them.